Hello everyone and welcome to our webinar with Stephanie Tobyn from the ORR. We're going to be talking about rail regulation, what, why and where next, and I'll let Stephanie introduce herself in a moment. I just want to point out that in your little go-to box there's a section for questions, so if you have any questions during the talk then please type them in there and let us know. We're going to have about 40-minute presentation with plenty of time for questions at the end. And I realised that I didn't introduce myself there, so I'm Heather Steele, the Networking and Development Manager for YRP Scotland. So welcome to our second webinar. I hope you enjoy it, and I'll pass over to Stephanie now.
Oh, hi Heather, thank you very much. I had no idea this was only your second webinar, so I'm now slightly terrified. But no, I'm very pleased to be here. I may not speak as long as 40 minutes, we'll see how this goes. But I'm really grateful to you for the invite. I think it's really interesting that you want to know more what different people do. I think it's really positive. I noted you'd been to Japan recently, or some of you had been, which I thought was excellent. But anyway, back to me. So I am the Deputy Director for Consumers at the Office of Rail and Road, and I'm going to tell you quite a bit about what ORR do. I am based in Glasgow and I have been with ORR for about 6 years, and I have a background in, strangely, energy. So I won't go into the detail there, but certainly I am not one of these people that's been in the railway industry for my entire career. But it certainly is an area that I find really interesting, very positive, and lots of really interesting jobs out there. So anyway, Heather, if you can move us on, that would be really helpful. Thank you. So what I'm going to cover is, for those people that don't know what the role of a regulator is, it might not sound exciting at first glance, but there's a lot to say about it. So what do we do and how do we do it? Also a bit of background to something that we spend a lot of time doing called the periodic review process, and the context for something called control period 6. So you might have heard of these things, you might not, but I will explain at a very high level what that all entails. My role is, well, predominantly on ORR's consumer work, so I want to explain that to you a little bit, because you will all be familiar with travelling by trains and all have issues and concerns and positives and negatives, so it'll be interesting to understand a bit about that. I've got a very short case study on accessibility, and then 2 slides just to summarise a little bit about some of the things that are going on just now, and time for questions. So thank you, Heather. Can you move on? Okay, so what is a regulator? We've given there, someone else very nicely put this together for me, we've given some examples of other regulators you might be more familiar with. Certainly I think people like Ofcom, Ofwat, Ofgem probably are very familiar in people's minds. And the text in the middle is actually just straight from, I think, the Oxford Dictionary around what do we call a regulator, what does it actually mean? But I would sort of probably describe it slightly differently from my perspective. I've worked for the energy regulator, Ofgem there, and now for ORR. I always think about regulators as traditionally being in place to actually, I suppose the traditional term is probably simulate competition in the market. Certainly in a lot of places where it is a network business, like an energy network, a telecoms network, a railway network, then there is really limited options for somebody going off and building a whole new network. So these are generally monopoly businesses, not entirely. There can be things on the sides that we can talk about later that are more competitive, but certainly that would be the traditional sense of regulation. You would have a network business and you would have a regulator, and the role of the regulator is very much to ensure that that business is effective and efficient, and to try and mimic the effects of competition on that business. Most businesses would be striving for market share, trying to reduce their costs, beat their competitors, trying to be efficient, and so some aspects of regulation are really trying to push that to a business that really doesn't have a huge amount of competition. And it's probably very important in some areas just because of the nature of the business. For example, in rail, you are really looking at a huge service that is effectively nationwide, and a lot of people rely on it. They spend a lot of money on it, and it's almost providing a public service to a large extent. In energy, it's providing a crucial service where effectively if you don't have energy, you can actually, it's pretty much a life service. You require energy, you require water, and when you're disconnected from either of these things, effectively it can be, unfortunately, life-threatening for people. So it sounds rather dire, but that is actually the case. Much I could say on that. But anyway, that's what a regulator is traditionally. So if we can move on, Heather, that would be good. Thank you. Okay, so ORR, what do we do? So this basically summarises a few key facts about us. We have around about 300 staff, so we're not a big regulator. We're split over around 6 offices. I'm based in Glasgow. The majority of staff are based in London, but we have 6 offices, and I'll explain why we have 6 offices in just a moment. We are established by various powers from Acts of Parliament, some of them very long-standing. So regulators are often established in primary legislation like this, and then there is a lot of secondary legislation called statutory instruments that sit under that give the regulator their powers. Quite often that would be the traditional setup. We are not unaccountable, so we don't do our own thing. We are, held to account by the UK Parliament, by the Senate and the Welsh Parliament, and by the Scottish Government. So we can be called to appear before these effectively committees in the parliaments to explain what we're doing and why, and to be questioned and to be tested really in that whole area. But we're also held to account by public law, and people or organisations could choose to judicially review us. And that's effectively look at a decision that we have taken and seriously question the legality of that decision, whether it was right or wrong. And if we get an opportunity to respond to a potential judicial review, but actually if it goes to formal judicial review, we could end up in court, where a court takes a decision on what we did. Our income there, just to give you an idea, in rail, it's just over 32 million. We also have a roads role, which is a grant from DFT, Department for Transport, and I'll explain briefly in a minute what that involves in the road sector, but it is only rail that we deal with in Scotland. So if you could move me on, please. So what do we do? So splitting it out very carefully, we look at rail safety. So we are the safety authority for the rail industry. So for most people when they go to work in their offices or factories, it would be the health and safety executive, but not for rail. Predominantly because of the complexity and specialist expertise required in the rail sector. There is a long history of rail safety in this area, and that sits with us, and we have around 100 inspectors, health and safety inspectors who are basically warranted inspectors who are able to basically carry out inspections on the network and deal with Network Rail in terms of their safety management systems. So it's a very important role, and the 100 or so inspectors that we have, they spend around 50% of their time doing frontline work. So they're not all office based, and if I go back to the previous slide, don't go back, it really explains why we have 6 offices, because we need those people to be near the part of the network that they are responsible for looking at. So we have a lot of health and safety inspectors in these more regional offices. So apart from inspections, they carry out investigations, and when there's been, for example, a derailment, as we had sadly very recently in Scotland, there are large investigations that get taken underway effectively after incidents. They can go on for quite a long time, and as a safety authority we are heavily involved in that. And they can also look at complaints, and it could be complaints from a member of the public, for example. So in terms of Network Rail's operating environment, we monitor whether or not Network delivers what it is setting out to do. We do a lot of monitoring, and I'll talk about how we do that later. But effectively, are Network Rail delivering on the commitments that they make and we will review that and assess that and look for evidence of that. We monitor rail enhancement projects, so in terms of operation and maintenance under the more operational side, but where there's an enhancement taking place and the network's perhaps being extended, and we have a monitoring role there. We look at access to track, so it is clearly not a free-for-all, and somebody needs to decide how train operating companies or freight operators are going to have access to the track and the stations that they want to use. And we also, it's very important, we also authorise new rolling stocks and new trains and new infrastructure, new stations. And I'm certainly very familiar with the new fleet authorisation process. Very sorry if that's very noisy. And we're very involved in that recently, where some older rolling stock was being reused. It was actually high-speed trains, HSTs, and they were being fitted out to be more accessible to meet modern day standards, and they had to be reauthorised. So very familiar with that. Financial side is the part of ORR where I sit. We monitor financial performance of Network Rail. I mentioned earlier, if you're looking at a large monopoly network, are they actually being efficient in what they're doing? We support third-party investors, which sounds a little strange, but it is very important if people do want to invest in the railways, let's call it that. They can understand the regulatory process, understand what they're required to do in terms of safety, and also as people are interested in investing in rail, it could be a local authority wanting to upgrade a station, it could be a train operator wanting to look at perhaps signalling, for example, it could be someone interested in retail at stations. So it's important that we give some guidance, because it's really important that new investment comes into the railway. And we also carry out the periodic review, which there was a whole slide on to come, of Network Rail and High Speed 1. High Speed 1 being part of the network that connects St Pancras with the Channel Tunnel. So that's an example of where there are two monopolies, effectively Network Rail running a bit of the network to St Pancras and High Speed 1 running it up to the Channel Tunnel. And my particular area is on consumers or passengers, and we are responsible for looking at consumer law, which applies irrespective of what you're doing. If you're buying a train ticket, buying a car, buying new windows, you're entering into an agreement or a contract with a consumer, and there is general consumer law that applies there. And it can be things like, do you understand what you've bought? So in rail, it could be, well, you bought a ticket for a train online and you didn't realise, and then you got there and your train was a bus. And would you have actually bought a ticket for a bus? Possibly not, but you should have known that at the start. So it's very fundamental things like that is information that passengers really need when they're making a decision whether to travel by train, and we try and ensure that that information is available and is consistent. The next box talks about passenger information, is the more general side. It's about, it's about the timetable, it's about when you're on the train, when the train has perhaps broken down, what the arrangements might be. So it's that more day-to-day operational side of things. We look at complaint handling procedures. So when the train operator receives a complaint, what do? Do they respond? Do they respond in 3 months? Do they respond in 2 days? How do they respond? Are you happy when they respond? And that whole process really is to make sure that you have a way to go to the train operator and get, satisfaction or get redress, whatever the case may be. It might be a refund, it might be compensation. And we also have a competition role. We are the competition authority for the rail industry. That doesn't sit directly with me, but certainly sits in my wider area. And in that area, we look at things like, for example, mergers. A recent one where we gave evidence to the European Commission actually was on a merger between Siemens and Alstom. And we were quite concerned that this merger would reduce competition in the market, particularly around signalling and rolling stock, because both these organisations are very heavily involved in that in the UK, and we felt the merger might reduce competition and potentially increase prices in that area. So we were involved in providing information to that decision, and that decision was actually, the merger was actually prohibited. But we can take our own competition cases on different issues as well. So without labouring the point, just a few more things about what we do at the bottom before we do what we don't do. In England and Wales, we monitor Highways England, and Highways England look after the strategic road network in England and Wales. We look at things like the investment strategy that they have in place. We monitor their performance. Again, are they being efficient? Are they delivering what they said they would deliver? And we've got enforcement powers in that area as well. But we have broad enforcement powers. Regulators generally have enforcement powers. So we have safety enforcement. We also have economic enforcement. In safety, we can do things like issue an improvement notice if we think Network Rail is not doing everything it could do in the safety side. But we can also issue a prohibition notice, which effectively says, stop doing what you're doing now, because we think it's so dangerous. So that is quite a powerful tool. Again, it's a similar tool to the Health and Safety Executive. And on the economic side, again, we can take different action. There's a lot of detail here, but effectively the ultimate sanction could be a financial penalty. But there's a lot more before you get to a financial penalty, and enforcement is generally seen to be a sort of nuclear option where you just can't resolve issues, improve issues without going for a financial penalty. So for all regulators, transparency underpins everything we do. We like putting things in the public domain. We like people to understand what we're doing and why. And we publish a lot of things on our website. So what we don't do, very clear, everybody understands, we don't have any role in rail franchising. That's for the Department for Transport, it's really for the funders, where it's for Transport Scotland. We don't set fares and ticketing policy. We are involved in this making sure you understand what you're buying concept, but not in terms of what tickets are available, what the prices are, when prices change. We are not involved in decisions on these big enhancement projects and rail investment. But I said we do monitor the strategic road network, but we don't monitor local highways and roads. So we have no highways role in Scotland, so that becomes a little bit confusing, but we're still the Office of Rail and Road. So Heather, can you pass to the next slide, please? Okay, so the periodic review process. This again is something that most regulators have a fundamental role in doing. They call it different things. But to set out the process very briefly for rail, what this means is the Secretary of State for England and Wales and also Scottish ministers set out very formally what it is they are looking to get from the railway. So this is called the high level output specification. And this could cover things like they want more freight growth, or they want to decarbonise the network, or they want higher performance in passenger trains. So they set out what their strategic vision is really for a 5-year period coming. And you can imagine at the moment a lot of that might be interesting for decarbonisation, might be a really big area for all ministers really. And then they also set out something called a Statement of Funds Available, a SOFA. So between the HLOS and the SOFA, you know what they want, so they've got the shopping list and you know how much they've got to spend. And the question is, what next? How does this work? So Network Rail produces a strategic business plan, and that sets out how it's going to go about delivering these requirements in the HLOS, so the shopping list, and how much it's going to cost. Well, here's their budget. And it's really ORR that looks at, well, are they going to achieve what they've set out in the strategic business plan in terms of the funds available? And it's up to ORR to decide on the funding for Network Rail. So it might be that we look at it and go, well, actually, we think they need to be more efficient in this particular area. Or it might be that we think actually to deliver the safety improvement in that area, they're going to need to spend more, or they should be spending more on vegetation management or earthworks and drainage. So there's a huge amount of detail really down at that level of what is Network Rail going to be looking at across a 5-year period. And ORR determining, yes, we think that is achievable in that period for this amount of money. And then we hold them to account. So we try and ensure that they do deliver that. Are they being efficient? Are they delivering on their commitments? Are they meeting the milestones that's been set for them? But it's a huge process. It generally gets called PR something, so periodic review 18 is the most recent one, which is when all of this was carried out, and it happens for a 5-year period, so it covers a control period, and at the moment it is control period 6. And believe it or not, we are starting to think about PR, periodic review 23, which will start in 2023. So it is an ongoing, very long and detailed process, but it is core to our role. Can I have the next slide, please? A couple of things just about PR18 that we thought it was worth mentioning. Network Rail decided to devolve some of its control and structure across the UK, and it did this to try and drive efficiency and to make better use of the network. and to meet the needs of end users. Because it's very important. If you think of someone in Scotland, in Transport Scotland, they have very specific needs that might not be the same maybe as someone in London, for example. So this devolution helps Network Rail interact with stakeholders, with funders, and look at the network in a different way that it might need to adapt differently regionally. So much of our work in Periodic Review 18 supported this shift, and we moved to something called route level regulation. So you can see the little diagram where we moved to these 8 geographical routes. That was Network Rail structure, and also a system operator. And the system operator is a very central function that deals with planning and making the best of the network and making the best of capacity on the network, and interestingly also dealing with timetabling. So we looked at each of these separately, and there was a settlement, so a final settlement about funding for each route and for the system operator. And so this was quite a dramatic shift, but the interesting thing is that it helps us as a regulator look at these different routes and go, well, look what's happening here. I'm not quite sure what's happening there, because they seem to be spending a lot on that and they're spending a lot less. Why is that? Is there something we can learn from that? Or they seem to be being very efficient, but they seem to be, there's a completely different approach here. So it allows for some level of comparison between effectively monopoly networks, which is a positive from a regulatory point of view, because you can see different approaches and hopefully share good practice. So next slide, please. And for everyone that's interested in numbers here, for control period 6, which is the current one after periodic review 18, on a GB level, you can see some of the numbers there, the really big numbers that are involved in this process. So 24.3 to fund maintenance and renewal work of the existing railway, with an increase in the renewal work of 17% from the previous control period, from the previous 5-year period. A commitment to the delivery of efficiencies of 2.6 billion over the 5-year period. Enhancements funds in PR 18 were covered, but actually they are specified by Department for Transport and Transport Scotland. And then a GB-wide fund, 245 million for research and development, which was backed by a new governance process to make sure that the whole rail network can benefit from any research that is carried out. A new performance innovation fund of £40 million to try and drive improvement and innovation, and an additional 80 million on safety improvements on top of the additional plans. So remember I said we can say actually we think that is going to need more to deliver. And interestingly, on the system operator, funding for an additional 100 timetabling staff, because we felt that was an area that really needed additional resource. So without going into any more on that, if we can move to the next slide, please, Heather. So on to the consumer work. So quite different from the periodic review process. A very quick overview of this, and then a little short case study. So first of all, I said that we dealt with retailing, and there are regulations that help us with that, consumer protection from unfair trading regulations, and there's also a code of practice to help companies. So this was effectively a statutory instrument, a piece of legislation that sometimes may not appear that obvious to companies that is covering them, or that it might cover things that they do. So we helped the industry put together a more practical guide, a code of practice to help them think about that. And we still get involved in this regularly, this whole area of retailing. We did a huge piece of work on ticket vending machines at one point, where it appeared that people were not buying necessarily the best ticket because they couldn't really understand the information they were being given by a ticket vending machine. So quite an important area if you're buying something, from a machine, that you're not getting told one thing and actually if you waited 10 minutes you could get a far cheaper price, for example, or that the jargon, there's a lot of jargon, as we all know, in the rail industry, that wasn't too confusing when you were buying a ticket. So we did a lot of work to try and improve that. So that's the end of our retailing limit, though it is really not about fares and ticketing policy, as I said. Then access. When we say access, it's really all about accessible travel. So many of you will realise that the rail network is not entirely built to new build standards. So if you're lucky enough to live near a new station, you'll be very aware that everything is really accessible to everyone. Really, you might have a lift, you might have a ramp, you might have tactile paving along the station. That there's been thought put into the different needs of different passengers. But a lot of stations are older and it's harder to bring these different improvements to the network. So we have, or it's going to take a lot of money, and when I say harder, I mean it's going to take a lot of money and a lot of time to do that. So we have a big role here in terms of the policies that the companies choose to use to help passengers. And they do have some really positive policies to provide assistance to certain passengers. And, you know, if they need assistance, for example, to board a train, if you are a wheelchair user and you can access a platform, it would be your first question. Is there a lift? Is there a ramp available? Then quite often you need a ramp to get from the platform to the train, because trains come in different sizes, heights. And that in itself requires a member of staff to actually secure that ramp for you to use. And there is a lot of policy around this area to ensure that the companies are offering a good service and a fair service. And if any of you are familiar, there's a lot of involvement here with the Equalities Act to ensure that people are given, you know, equal treatment, really, even in transport, where, as I said, there are challenges, but the policy side should be able to make that easier. And there's also a code of practice in place here that we look at, and it deals with these standards at accessible stations. So it's less likely to be an issue at a brand new station built from scratch, more likely to be an issue where changes are happening, or it's an older station, or it's not very well used station, and again, might have some sort of heritage protection, and these are really quite big issues. I mentioned earlier we deal with passenger information, trying to ensure that information is full and complete and people can make good decisions, first of all at the retail side when they're buying tickets, but also throughout their journey, particularly when there is disruption. And if anybody's been, you know, had recent rail disruption, been on a train for a long period of time, they're just desperate to know, you know, what's going to happen, what's happening, who knows I'm here, what's the next step, can I tell people, am I likely to move soon, you know, and there's all sorts of issues around passenger information. And generally when there was a big incident on the railway, it comes to the fore that this issue can be very hard to deal with, very hard to make information consistent and useful and given out to everybody at the same time. And then finally, we deal with what we broadly call redress. So it's whether or not you have a complaint, can you get it dealt with, but also can you claim compensation when your train is late. All of the train operators have compensation schemes. These are not set by us, they are again set by DfT or Transport Scotland, depending on what's going on, but there are different sort of schemes and different amounts of money that can be claimed, and a lot of people don't know that. They don't know that maybe they could travel on a train and be 15 minutes late and be eligible for a proportion of the ticket back. And so we are trying to ensure that those compensation arrangements are working well, that they are fair, that people can access them, and that they're aware that they can do it. Because you might choose you don't want to use it, but you may not know about it, and you may have spent quite a lot of money on your ticket. So those are the areas that fall within my remit, largely. If we can have the next slide, Heather, please. I won't talk about this in detail, but I thought it was useful to set out how do we go about this? What is involved in this regulatory process that's not the price review process? There's a lot of engagement with all of the companies, and there's a lot of us ensuring that they understand what the requirements are on them. And there's just a lot of constant interaction, especially with, I think, 20, I'll get this wrong, let's say 25, 26 companies that we end up dealing with on a regular basis. There is a lot of engagement. We do a lot of monitoring, and I'm going to talk about that in a minute. But by monitoring, I mean ensuring that what companies are expected to do is actually happening in practice, and having evidence, and not just anecdotal evidence, but actual real data and evidence to say, well, actually, we're not sure that is happening, and we can use that to change behaviour. We then analyse all of this evidence and data that we might collect, and you can't see the word there, it's above that strange turquoise box, but it actually says transparency, and I mentioned that we like transparency. We put information into the public domain, and it gives confidence to passengers and users and funders that actually somebody's overseeing all of this, and actually, yes, they could take action if this wasn't working well. And interestingly, having information, having a leak table, for example, with lots of train companies on it, can actually spur people into thinking, I wonder why I am 2/3 of the way down there, and they can potentially change their behaviour. You can just move on, it's fine, it's fine. I won't talk for too much longer. So this is just a very quick, I think it's 3 slides, case study of type of thing that we do. This one's on accessibility, and this is where we went about gathering data and insight in an area where there was not a huge amount. There was a lot of anecdotal evidence, but there wasn't a real solid, robust source of evidence for us. So we looked at this process of passengers requesting assistance in the main. The one that is circled is certainly the experience of booking assistance, where you contact the train operator and you say, I'm on this journey. I require, the one I used earlier, a ramp to alight the train, to board the train, and also to alight the train. And here are my details. And you have made a booking. You've said, I'm coming, I'm travelling on that train, got my ticket, I need a bit of help. And that booking effectively gets accepted by the train operator. And we wanted to know, well, how's that working? Because the industry didn't seem to have any data, but we could see that at times there were some very terrible stories. People being, as they put it, stranded on the train. People potentially doing things to get off the train that were quite unsafe. So we wanted to understand what was happening. So we carried out around 9,000 interviews online and on telephone of passengers that had recently used this service. So a great one of, we've just had the service, it's very fresh in your mind. Are you interested in telling us how that went? And we got all of the results at the, as we call it, a train operator level. So we could look across the company. So it wasn't just one company, we could look across all the companies. And you can see there we did other things as well, but I want to focus on the one with the circle, experience of booking or booked assistance. And I'll tell you a bit more about that. If you can move on, please, Heather. So this is an example of the data, and this is our most recent monitoring in this area. So as I said, we have all the companies there on the left, including Network Rail, because they are very important in this. They provide almost a third of all the assistance that passengers receive because they run a lot of managed stations. And you can see the sample size that we got there. So we always aim to get around about 100. We see for Avanti, we got a lot. 100 responses to kind of give us a sort of, well, we feel fairly robust in these figures. And then we looked at these well, we looked at a lot of things, but here's some examples of things we looked at. We looked at whether all the assistance the passenger had asked for was received. We looked at how happy they were. And then we just looked at an overall sort of satisfaction score. So you can see it could be better, I think is the best way to put it. You know, there is nobody down at sort of 20, 30%, but you know, it's very, very rarely you're going to see sort of a 90%, although I can see one at LNER. But what really intrigued us was this one about all assistance was received. So you've, again, I go back to, you've said you're coming, you've got your ticket, you've said what you require, you've made a booking, and that's been accepted. So you've entered into that arrangement with a company, and then you don't get what you've asked for. Why is that? So we could see this 74%, the one circle just at the bottom, is the national average of 74% get everything they've asked for. So the question for us is, well, what about everybody else? And what does that mean in practice? And what's being done about that? So we brought this level of transparency to this particular issue. And if we can move on, please, we decided to look into it a bit further. So I said 74% got everything they asked for, 13% got some assistance, and 12% got nothing. So we can see a very consistent difference between how reliable this service was when you were booking assistance, boarding a train. So you can see that pretty much 87% received assistance boarding a train. Now again, you might question, and we haven't gone there yet, why is it 87% if you've made a booking? What's happened? But it can be things like the passenger then goes to the wrong place, or the train's about to leave, or there was someone that helps them, and so they manage, they get by. But versus alighting assistance, this dropped. And this was a concern for us because particularly if you require the same assistance to board and alight a train, then why is this difference in performance? And when we talked to all of the operations, I said we do a lot of engagement and Network Rail, we could see that staff were often not there to meet the passengers. They would arrive, train would stop at the station, doors would open, someone potentially sitting there could be a wheelchair user, nobody was there to help them. And unfortunately, that anecdotal side, there is sufficient anecdotal concern in that area. Passengers can do some strange things to try and stop the door closing. Because, to be honest, we would all be panicked at the fact that we were going to miss our station and weren't sure whether we were going to get help at the other end. So you want to get off, we want to get off. That's obviously part of the agreement you've made with the operator. So for these alighting failures, as they're called, it's mainly driven by a communication failure. It's basically information being transferred between the station and saying, this passenger's on this train, they've made a booking, and you have to help them off at that time off that train. And the same thing applies to something we call turn up and go passengers, but to a greater extent. And turn up and go is where you've not made a booking. So it's a bit harder because nobody knows. They could be busy, and then you say, can I get help? And you might be assisted onto a train, but then you've got to go through this process so that somebody will assist you off the train. And this is a long, long and detailed piece of work, but I thought it was just interesting just to say, this is how we've used this data. We've delved into this issue, and it's now resulted in some changes. And the changes sound a little bit old-fashioned, but if I just explain that to you. The first of all, it was, well, the staff were not necessarily contacting staff at other stations. So we've asked for a phone number, effectively, to be in place for all the stations to ensure that these calls can take place. Now that sounds very old school to everyone, I'm sure, but there is no technology in place here. So it would be far easier if you had a mobile phone, a smartphone, and you could just say to such and such a station that this passenger was coming, here was the requirements that they have, and send that through, and somebody somewhere gets a message, and it will be, that's their job to do that, to help you off. But actually we are working at the level of phone calls regularly. There are plans to introduce new technology, but they have not come to fruition yet. And that has been quite a while in discussion now across the industry. But clearly there are ways that this can be done better. All we've said is, until that technology arrives, we really want something firmer to be in place. What else have we done? Well, we've looked at the information, setting out what information needs to be passed between stations. So what is important here? If the passenger has a seat reservation, that's good. You know where they're going to be, and you can assist them off the train. But if they haven't got a seat reservation, you might need to know what part of the train they're in. You might need to know what type of assistance they need. You might need to know other things, so they may have said, oh, I need help, just support getting off the train because, I've got a mobility impairment. But actually, they may also have 3 suitcases. And so to kind of even have these little bits of information, it's very helpful. So we've tried to say, well, here's the information that's core to making sure this happens. And finally, we have asked for a person to be responsible for making and receiving these calls. And this doesn't have to be a person actually at the station, and it very much depends on the operation that the train operator runs, how this best suits their arrangement, and whether or not they can perhaps centralise some of these calls. But effectively, somebody gets the call and somebody is responsible for making sure this happens. And as I said, there's a lot of detail. So what I would end on that is say that is definitely not rocket science. I'm pretty sure you will all agree. However, it was born out of data that didn't exist, which is surprising when you're providing a service but not checking on it in that way. And it has helped lead to something that, again, definitely not rocket science, but it should improve the reliability of this service, and we can measure that. And we are not dictating this in the way that says this can't be improved. We're just saying, as a minimum, we think this could work better, and we worked with all of the companies to try and understand if this would help, including Network Rail. And until the point where the industry itself brings something better, for example, an app, we think this is a good way forward for passengers. So it's an example of policy development in the consumer area. So if we can move on, just a couple of slides left. Thank you. I thought Martin did tell me that you'd had a lot of information about COVID, a lot about fogging and hand sanitizers and masks. Now, I don't want to mention any of that, but I thought I would just give a sort of brief 2 slides on what we thought about the industry response to COVID. So if we think about what happened, demand and revenues collapse. There was falls in freight demand and fears of high staff absences. So that was where we started. Train timetables were then reduced, focus on key workers and freight, and then timetables have now been gradually increased. The government has stepped in to financially support passenger operators. They've removed the revenue risk due to the fact that nobody is actually travelling to support the companies or nobody was travelling for a large period of time, and they've introduced what they've called emergency measures agreements, and this is very helpful in supporting the companies financially. ORR thought, well, what does the industry need here? What can we do? We provided revised safety guidance to help staff working at stations, to help staff working on the network, to ensure that that process worked well and didn't result in sort of breakdown, but people could come up with ways of working with COVID. And we also delayed other work. We know that most people, including myself, are working at home, and we wanted to reduce the burden on companies if we were going to try and do something that really was going to be very hard to do with people working at home. But the issues came pretty thick and fast: financial problems, social distancing, face coverings. So there was just a constant flow of issues. But I think overall, the way we would describe it was there was a high degree of cooperation amongst all the companies, and a focus on the opportunities the situation could present. And it has presented opportunities. If we think about the network, there was a lot less traffic on the network in terms of operation and maintenance and renewals. There could be work done in the network that actually previously would be very hard to do. So that certainly was one opportunity. It's helped look at timetabling. So performance is clearly incredibly high now because the number of trains running was a lot lower, and something that people don't think so much about, but actually things like dwell times of trains at stations has reduced because the capacity for the train is less. People are able to go on and off faster. The train is able to stick within defined time it should be at the station. So the whole timetable and performance on the network has improved. So I think that shows that even in such terrible times, the industry did very well. It was quick, it was decisive and impressively responsive, and is now trying to look at, well, what could improve because of COVID. And just the penultimate slide, please, Heather. Thank you. So more strategically, because I did put what next, and there's very little I can say about what next, but I thought it was worth just saying. Prior to COVID, the government had planned to reform rail with a white paper and also with legislation. And there was widespread discussion about a new structure, potentially a change in the franchising arrangements and a new rail body that would maybe bring track and train together. So there's been no decision announced on that as yet, but there's likely to still be interest in it. So COVID came at a time when it almost ended the ability to push forward with that. But could it be pushed forward in a way that didn't require new legislation and didn't have to go through this whole legislative process? And certainly there are things that can be achieved that way. I think the thing to say about regulation is it's very adaptable. So it can do different things with different sectors. It can wrap around the structure of the industry and still deliver a positive outcome in terms of having that oversight and holding to account role. So this is all being thought about now, really, about how the new structure may evolve. And more importantly, at the moment, because of everything that's happened with COVID, it's really important for the railway to survive and to start building, because it's a huge commitment for the economy to have such a big sector and to have so much workforce and to have the ability to really stimulate jobs and employment in this whole area. So there's likely to be a significant focus on what can happen in terms of building and upgrading the network. But also we think decarbonisation is likely to be a very serious factor going forward in all of our discussions for Network Rail. And I think lots of recent events have fed into that. So I'm going to end there because I need a drink of water partly, and see if there are any questions, please. Thank you.
Hi, Stephanie. Thank you. Thank you for that. That was really interesting. If anybody does have any questions, please pop them in on the question tab. But I actually do have a couple, so don't worry. We will have some questions while we're waiting for those to come in. So one of my questions was about that case study that you outlined and the data monitoring. And I think that was really interesting that the operators weren't monitoring that. And I was wondering who continues the monitoring going forward.
It's a good question. Well, the way that we structured it, we wanted to understand what was happening. So we actually initiated it all ourselves. And the way that we did it was we worked with all of the operators to agree text for an email. And effectively, when you book assistance to travel, you then get an email confirmation, and at the end of that you have a link to an independent party who can then send you details of how did it go, what did you think, and you can provide your feedback. And because that worked well, and because we'd already started the process, we actually decided to continue it. And so now we are, which sounds quite odd, but we are paying for and collecting this information and data, but we think it is so important, and it helps us so much understand, are things changing or improving, that we want to continue with at the moment. Ideally, the industry would do it themselves, but I think we've got this far with it that we are continuing. So if that helps.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I imagine it's not the same for all the other data that you're collecting, but some of that will come directly from operators.
Absolutely, there's a huge amount of information provided by operators, and we do spend a lot of time analysing that. We have our own information and analysis team within the Office of Rail and Road. We publish a lot of statistics, so we are, I think, the repository for the all of the rail statistics in the industry. We have a big data set on that, and we carry out a lot of analysis on that. So yes, there was a huge amount. Data and regulators, it pretty much goes hand in hand, and when you do get concerned is where you're not able to get information of that type from a company. It does beg the question, why is that, and how do they know that they're doing something well or doing something efficiently, or are they doing the right things at all when that sort of understanding is not there.
Yeah, it is a concern that sort of, obviously it's difficult to monitor all aspects of performance, but it's a concern when something is quite evidently being left behind, and by as it sounds, by all operators. So I have a question here, and I can't actually see who it's from, unfortunately. And it says, thank you for your informative presentation. Given that the ORR regulates rail and road outside of Scotland, how much is being done to transfer learning and skills between the two sectors, and is that something that ORR facilitates or helps with?
It's a question that came up recently. I have somebody in my team who has moved from our roads, I was going to call it directorate, but effectively the part of ORR that works on roads. And it would seem sensible, but actually the frameworks are quite different. The legal framework and the role that we have between the two is quite different. So how Highways England operates, it wouldn't make an easy comparison at this point in time, but I do think we do question ourselves over, are there things we should be doing differently? Could we do things like, I know they are doing work on, I know it sounds odd, but everybody that travels in a car on part of their network is a customer, and they do research on satisfaction, and it does make me think, well, that's odd, because how does that work, and how do they go about it? Because it's quite odd, because you've not, you've been on the network, you've not got a ticket as such for it, like a train company. And I do wonder if there is more we could do to kind of share things on my side that might add value. But certainly it's something we're aware of. It's not there yet, but certainly it could develop.
Yeah, I think it's interesting, and I think there's certainly a lot of businesses or areas where rail are looking to import skills from other industries. So to say, that question was from Tom Miners, who's a rail structures engineer in Arup.
Okay.
Okay. Building from that, I had another question about ORR looking into both road and rail, and it touched on your last point about the decarbonisation. And what I was wondering was sort of, how, as the regulator for both, are you managing, the idea of modal shift from road to rail, and presumably there's a periodic review for road as well, and are you having to say things like, road, well, we don't want to be investing in road anymore, we want to regulate you, but ultimately we want passengers? I know it's a bit of a leading question, but
it's not. I can see why it makes perfect sense. I really, really can. But you have to. There's a very simple answer to it. Is really that we don't set the policy in that area to sort of deliver the intermodal shift, but we monitor how the companies deliver on the government policy, which I think is the important distinction. We are not the decision maker on how that might work. And when I talk about decarbonisation, for example, in Scotland, I'm more familiar with it here. For Network Rail, for example, it's all about really greater electrification of the network. And yes, Transport Scotland have a role in roads as well, but again, we are not looking at that in Scotland. So I'm sorry, it's a bit of a slight divergent answer. I think it's a good question that unfortunately we're not the body responsible for setting that agenda.
Yeah, so you can't divest funds from road into
No.
rail and manage
No, that would be useful. I mean, we get grant funding from DFT and we get what's called levies from the industry, and the levies from the industry are very much, they have to stay focused on on rail, and the funding for roads needs to stay focused on roads, and that's very clear. Yeah.
Okay, I've got another couple of questions here, which I'm struggling to read. 1 second. Because I can't see. Oh, there we go. I can make it bigger. This is from Peter, who's from Transport for Greater Manchester. I think that abbreviation's for. And he says, "Thank you for the presentation. I'd like to know how the future role of our ORR might need to evolve in light of potential changes to the rail industry, particularly in the current emergency franchise arrangements, particularly if they become something permanent."
Yes, I know, and that is the sort of million-dollar question, isn't it? I think if you think about what the overarching position is, it really is around reducing the fragmentation, and whether you think that's a good thing or a bad thing, franchising seems to be on the way out. And if things are brought together, I suppose it's a question for government: where do they need this additional independence and this additional oversight of the type that we can provide? And irrespective of whether or not, for example, Track and Train came together, or there was a new body created, or some sort of combination of things happening there, I think there will be a role for regulation in providing that independence. I think because there is so much history on this, because there is so much expertise in that, and because it's just genuinely, the classic, as we like to say internally, you don't want to be marking your own homework. So having that kind of oversight role in some shape or form, and whether or not it's more on the franchise side, on the network side, both together, or on some independent body, I think it's still essential. And I think it will, I can't see things differing. I think when I was talking about adapting, I was very much thinking about how we go about regulation, and it is different, so if you think about how, for example, I was talking about all the traditional regulators at the front. If you think about how something like NHS or education is regulated, they're more public services, but they still have regulators, and maybe we don't all think about them or know about them even. But actually, if you had to go and look for one and work out who holds this organisation to account as a public service provider for being efficient, for using taxpayers' money effectively, for delivering what government has asked it to, then they still exist. So that's how I see it, but I can't answer the what exactly will it look like, and where will we end up. Very interesting times.
Yeah, definitely. I'm just trying to see if there are any more questions on here. If you do have any, please ask, and I'm going to try and figure out how to make this box bigger so that I can read them all more easily. But while we wait for something to come in, I had quite so you could tell it's a silly question because it's from me. But when you're talking about the consumer data and monitoring, how people buy tickets and the information that they get, when I travel, I get most of that, say, from National Rail Inquiries. So it's really interesting saying, well, who actually owns that and runs it, and is that something that the ORR is involved in, or not?
We're not involved in it. It's run by the industry itself. It's run by the rail delivery group, really, which I would probably get short, but I tend to think of them as a sort of trade body for the sector. They do a lot of these centralised things, and running National Rail Inquiries is part of their role. It's very interesting because the thing that we're caught up in almost now is an ongoing issue, but it's got a whole lot better, but there are still, if you like, outsider issues. It's that National Rail Inquiries gets a lot of good information from Network Rail itself, from the people that were running the timetable, and it is, I would say personally I would use that. However, then other people use different things. and perhaps these other bodies, other organisations or apps or websites, they can take data feeds from national rail inquiries that gives them the same rich data that NRE has, but they don't always take them all. And that is very challenging. So again, we have to look at, well, you know, what's our role here? What tools have we got? Great regulatory thing. What tools have we got? And we have got tools over third parties. So if I say one, for example, like Trainline, very big ticket seller, then we regularly speak to Trainline and other third parties who are selling tickets. And we have the ability to speak to them under that guise of consumer law, because they're still providing a service and they're still selling something that you need to know what you're buying. And if you fundamentally might not buy it, if you had that bit of information, then that gives us concern. So anyway, I don't know if that answers your question, but it's industry-run national rail inquiries, and there's lots of other things available. I have to say that caveat, as well as Trainline.
Yeah, you're not selling it.
I'm not promoting anybody. No, I shouldn't have said that I use national rail inquiries, but I'm just being honest with you.
No, that's fine. I was wondering, there's obviously quite a lot of like say of different players in the rail environment and the industry, and you know, obviously ORR work very closely with all of the operators and bringing that together, but they're not the only person or industry body or whoever. So it's quite complex and in terms of who looks after.
I think it is for passengers, and the thing that interests us also is, do they realise when they're using some third parties that they're paying a level of commission that they wouldn't necessarily pay if they bought a ticket off a train operator's website directly? Small commission, but still paying a commission. Again, is that apparent to everybody? So there's lots of issues. There's lots of things you could discuss in that area.
So I can't see that any more questions have come up, and we've probably filled enough of your time with my silly questions anyway. But that was a really interesting presentation. It's really interesting to know more about what the ORR does as a regulator. So thank you for sharing that with us, and I'm sure all of our attendees have found that very informative, as the questions do say. It was an interesting presentation. So thank you, Stephanie. Thank you, everyone, for attending, and we'll wrap up there. I just want to draw your attention to our event that's taking place on the 10th of October, which is a physical event, which is a trek, sections 5 and 6 of the John Muir Way. It will be socially distanced. We are limited to 20 people, and there are 8 spaces left. So if you want to challenge yourself, it starts at Falkirk High, and we'll be walking to the 4th Railway Bridge. So very in keeping with the rail theme. And we're raising money for the railway children. So if you want to join the team, please do. If you want to donate, then you can find out that information on the YRP events page as well. So hopefully some of you will join us, and yeah, that will be our first physical event this year, provided that the restrictions don't change again. So thank you.
Thank you very much, everyone, and good luck with your walk.
Thank you, Stephanie.
Thank you, bye.
Bye.